to my picture. We're going to switch gears into, so what? So if there's methylmercury in the water or in the fish, how does that really affect wildlife or human health? Selenium's ability to moderate and protect against mercury toxicity is what we'll talk about. The current thinking on that, we'll talk about later also, is ensuring that normal selenium-protein synthesis is maintained, and that's selenium's dependent enzymes that run a lot of human processes. There is no doubt that methylmercury can cause great harm. An extreme example of this occurred in Minamata, Japan, where inhabitants were exposed to 27 tons of mercury waste dumped in the bay, but with no corresponding shift in selenium levels. Here, this was a small bay, lots of inhabitants around it, that their primary source of food was fish.
Claudia?
Yes.
There's some in this audience are unfamiliar with the term or the noun selenium. A couple of people here didn't know that that was a one of the minerals.
Right.
So what is
that's
it?
a micronutrient. Your body needs it. We'll be covering that.
Okay.
A large body of evidence has been published that indicate supplemental dietary selenium moderates or counteracts mercury toxicity. Mercury exposures that might otherwise produce toxic effects are counteracted by selenium. Selenium is required for brain function, nervous system function, and it also will amalgamate with mercury. Selenium has a high affinity to bind with mercury, but binding to other substances, such as brain tissue. Excuse me a minute. The bond formed is irreversible. Once it's combined, it's not going to break apart.
You're talking about the selenium and the mercury.
Selenium and mercury.
So once it binds together, it is not going to in any way separate again?
No, not even chemically.
Okay.
Selenium is mercury's #1
Adversary.
Huh?
Adversary.
Yeah, no, it's the one that mercury loves to combine with.
Yeah.
It's over 100 times. Selenium has 100 times greater chance of combining with mercury than any other substance. All higher animal life forms require selenium-dependent enzymes to protect their brains against oxidative damage. And that's where you asked about selenium. It's a micronutrient our body needs. We don't need mercury. However, if there's enough selenium, excess of selenium, after it combines with mercury, our bodies require that. At high exposure, selenium and mercury can each be individually toxic, but evidence supports the observation that co-occurring selenium and mercury antagonistically reduce each other's toxic effects. Do you all understand that?
What's the presence of selenium in our natural environment, especially within the gold-bearing streams?
Studies of data that has looked all across the United States says that 95 to 100% of all areas in the U.S. have sufficient selenium. Now so the selenium-mercury issue has been around since 1967, and I've just picked a few articles to tell you about. In 1978, scientists from Sweden were reporting that mercury is accompanied by selenium in all investigative species of mammals, birds, and fish, adding that it seems likely that selenium will exert its protective action against mercury toxicity in the marine environment. In 2000, a group of scientists published research of mercury and selenium tests performed on the muscles, organs of healthy fish, shellfish, birds, seals, whales, and polar bears. They found that selenium was represented in substantial surplus compared to mercury in all animal groups and tissues. Do you have a question? Further research at the University of Ontario reported that selenium deposits from metal smelters into lake water greatly decreased the absorption of mercury by microorganisms, insects, and small fish, suggesting strong antagonism effect of selenium on mercury assimilation. So that's an added benefit. That's not just amalgamating and binding it. That's actually reducing the level that will bind. I mean, reduce all that the animals can take into their body. In 2009, a good friend of Joe and I, he was one time, Spence Peterson at EPA and his group collected 468 fish representing 40 species from 130 sites across 12 U.S. states, the 12 western states, where they were analyzed for whole body selenium and mercury concentrations. The fish samples were evaluated relative to a wildlife protective mercury threshold of 0.1 micrograms mercury per gram of wet weight, and the current tissue-based methylmercury water quality criteria for the protection of humans, 0.3 micrograms of mercury per gram of wet weight, and presumed protective against mercury toxicity, where the selenium to mercury molar ratios are greater than 1. That means there needs to be at least an equal amount of mercury and selenium to combine and an excess of selenium for human health. You guys all got that? Okay, here's a plot that he did looking at selenium mercury molar ratio. This is the 1-to-1 line right here, against the total length of fish. Larger fish collect more mercury than small fish. And you can see this line. Above it, they have sufficient selenium, and all the mercury's been amalgamated. Below it, those fish have too much mercury. There wasn't enough selenium. And that, you can see here, are piscivores. They're fish that eat other fish. Again, you plot it here. You can see the wildlife threshold and the human health threshold. Irrelevant. Here's the 1-to-1 molar ratio. And this is, the blue line is where selenium would exceed. Selenium can also be toxic in too high a level, and there's nothing in there. But there are a few fish right here, and I'll tell you right now, those were all pike minnows. I don't know how many of you eat pike minnows, but they were, out of all the fish, they did salmonids, trout, bass, pike minnows, pretty much all represented all the fish species in the western states. Everything is protected to a large extent by selenium. Did I miss something, Joe? Seems like there was something else. These are the 12 western states, and these yellow dots represent where the samples were taken. In Washington, you guys that are familiar with Washington, where are we? Is that the peninsula?
Yeah, that's
What is this?
Us.
And here.
That's here?
That's here.
Okay, we took lots of they took samples there. And right here?
Walla Walla.
Walla Walla area? Okay.
Yakima, maybe. Yakima.
Most of the piscivores, most of the pike minnows in that study were right here. Oh, wait a minute. Sorry, right here.
Oregon?
In Oregon. Results showed that 97.5% of all freshwater fish in the survey had sufficient selenium to potentially protect them and their consumers against mercury toxicity. That's the next slide. Peterson's study concluded data from samples collected in California which in all cases contained proportions of mercury to selenium that were adequate to protect fish, wildlife, and human health. The California results were 100% protective. And I say that, I used this slide when I gave this presentation to the California Department of Fish and Wildlife in the Public Advisory Committee that Joe and I were on for the environmental, for suction dredging. That led to the environmental impact report. They ignored us. Mercury toxicity only occurs in populations exposed to foods containing disproportionate quantities of mercury related to selenium. One of those areas was in the Faroe Islands, off of New Zealand. That was one of the major children's studies they did. Guess what they ate? Where they got all this toxicity from? Pilot wells. Their main source of food was from pilot wells. Oh, and then there was a corresponding study done in the Seychelles Islands that was an 8-year study looking at children still in the womb through 8 years old. And they didn't look at selenium per se, but they ate fish. Their primary was fish, which had mercury levels similar to the U.S., and they had no adverse effects. In fact,
I
their
lived in the
test scores were
Seychelles,
good.
and it's all fish.
Fish.
That's all they eat.
Here, the EPA says two to 4 meals of fish a week. They eat that in a day.
Yeah. No, it's all 3 meals.
And there was no problem. So, after this study came out, the author of the study was asked why. Why it's so much different than the Faroe study? His answer was probably selenium. They didn't measure selenium, but that was the only excuse for it. Okay, so selenium is the key to understanding mercury exposure risks. That's the most important thing to take out of here. OEHHA is the Office of Environmental Health Hazards Assessment in California. I contacted them before the Public Advisory Committee meeting in California, and they say that no one in California has ever been sick or died of mercury poisoning from eating sport fish. Sport fish is freshwater fish, as opposed to ocean fish. Yet they still give out fish consumption warnings to publish them for public use. Current mercury advisories focus only on mercury levels in fish. They do not account for the beneficial nutrients of the selenium-mercury or a selenium-mercury interaction. Although this research has been around since 1967. 40 years plus of research illuminates the conclusion of hundreds of journal articles that indicate mercury is not a threat to the environment or human health if the molar ratio of selenium to mercury meets that defined criteria. Current studies show that 95 to 100% of U.S. has adequate selenium to be protective of human health. Where there is adequate selenium in the environment, methylmercury is non-toxic and will not cause harm to fish or human health. That's my talk. Any questions?
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah. Let's don't stop there.
Bruce, go ahead.
Was there a recent report by the California Water Board that shows? Would you?
California Water Board just published a fish survey that they did across California in 2013. In that, they had two study areas in southern California. All the rest were in central to northern California. In that, they mainly looked at trout because it was easy for them to catch, I guess. They did look at some pike minnows, salmonids, and bass of various types. And what they found was they didn't have a high enough methylmercury to cause any harm to fish or human health. The only high values they found were in pike minnows. No surprise there.
You-